is that they were those days matter because of what happened on D-Day. Sometimes one day stands out above the others. We've all got birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, all those other red letter days. You know, the day you got saved or the day you got baptized. For Naomi and Ruth, this is the day of days. Something is about to happen that is going to change their life forever for these two widows. Now, so far, Ruth has experienced extreme kindness from a man named Boaz. She knows who he is, but she doesn't know why he matters. Ruth doesn't know about his connection to Naomi, and Naomi doesn't know about his kindness to Ruth. All we know so far is that Ruth happened to glean in the field of Boaz. She just so happened to choose to glean there. Now, you need to understand, I mean, we've talked about this before, but just remind you again that the law said that farmers were required to leave gleanings behind. They weren't allowed to clean their fields completely because it was a way of feeding the poor. The poor could get out and glean from the field and get the leftovers, and farmers generally, most of them follow the law, and so they would leave just enough so that you wouldn't starve to death. It wasn't a way to get you weren't going to get fat or anything like that, but it was a way to feed yourself, kind of their own social welfare system. Everybody, even if you were the poorest person in Jerusalem or in Israel, you could glean from the fields to get food. So you weren't going to starve to death. I mean, that was part of the purpose. The other thing that you need to understand is that everybody who was part of the family had something called a redeemer. And that kinsman redeemer within the family was somebody who could redeem land, could buy back, if you got into trouble or you got sold into slavery, that person was the person who could buy you back and set you free, and he could restore your land to us. Now, you need to understand that Israel was set up very different the way our world is today. Everything was bought and sold based on when the next year of Jubilee was. Houses and property were sold based on how long it was till the next year of Jubilee. And the further it was in the year of Jubilee, the more you got for it. But if it was the year of Jubilee in 2 years, you weren't going to get as much as if it was 20 years. Because everything had to return to the original owners on the year of Jubilee. And all slaves had to be freed every 7 years. You weren't allowed to keep slaves. So people weren't allowed to buy slaves for longer than 7 years. They had to set them free. All slaves. So the purchase of slaves, and there were slavery. Slavery is not new. It's not something America invented, regardless of one of our stupid senators saying that. Or actually, the governor of Virginia actually said that America invented slavery. He's full of baloney, but anyway, obviously he needs a history lesson. Slavery is not new. It's not normal. It's not something unusual. Slavery's been around probably 7,000 to 10,000 years. It's not It's not unusual. Europeans own slaves. White people own slaves. Black people own slaves. It really doesn't mean race never really had anything to do with slavery. It had to do with who was the more powerful. Generally, is all it was. And if the institution of slavery is not normal. It's not new. It's not unusual. The Romans owned slaves. In fact, the Romans have a special class of slave called a pedagogy, which we've talked about before. A pedagogy was a personal slave personal slave used, and understand, the Roman law for slavery was very different than the Jewish law. You had slaves for life. People born into slave, bought and sold. Israel's slavery was very, very different. And I think part of that was because they spent 300 years as slaves in Egypt, and their laws were based on what God said. And I know you don't need a history lesson, but I want to fill in all this because you need to know some of the background for some of this to make sense. And so basically, in the pedagogy was somebody assigned to your kids to be their personal tutor. And their very life depended on your kid doing well in school. So they were like the best teachers there were because they knew that their life depended on it. They were going to die if the kid failed in school. And so, even though it might have been the kid's fault, the kid might be lazy or the kid might be stupid or whatever. Probably the best word not to call them stupid, but The kid just had a learning problem, but it didn't matter. That kid either succeeded in school or the slave died. That was called the pedagogy, and that's where we get the word, where that we use the phrase pedagogy to mean learning style or a learning plan or program. The pedagogy of a child in today's world is their method of learning. Now, you don't need to know all that, and it has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but I want you to get some background here because I want you to understand what's going on here in Ruth. All we know for sure is that Ruth didn't know any of this. Naomi didn't know any of this, and as far as Ruth knows, she just happened to glean on the field of Boaz, who went out of his way to honor and protect her. She recognizes the hand of God in how he treated her, but beyond that, she cannot see the big picture. These closing verses of Ruth 2 tell us how these two widows, one old and one young, respond to God's amazing grace. Ruth returns home tired but glad, carrying an armful of fresh grain and roasted grains so that she could feed the two women for many, many days. You see, the problem is that so much of us, God blesses us, and we're so expectant of it that we stop recognizing when it's God's hands. But how do you react when God comes through? What do you do when your prayers are answered? How do you respond to God's extreme kindness to you? And I'm not talking about the big things. I mean, most of us, we pray for God to heal us, and God heals us, and we're all excited, and we're telling everybody. But what about thanking God for the little things that it happens every single day? Little things that we don't stop to realize that they're God's work, that God's in control. You see, one of the things that we teach in this church, one of the basic principles is that God is always at work and that he invites us to join him. God's at work. He invites us to join him. We have to make a decision. We usually have to make adjustments in order to join him. He loves us. He wants us to join him. He invites you. You have to make adjustments in order to join him in what he's doing. But he's always at work. And everything that happens around you, it is God at work. God's permissive will and God's main will, but the bottom line is it's always God in control. And you cannot never forget that. You cannot sit there and say, God didn't help me in this. Well, yeah, he did. He just didn't notice it. You were too busy worrying about the problems. And God was taking care of things even when you didn't notice it. So how do we respond to God's goodness? Well, here's what Naomi and Ruth do. They celebrate. Yes, celebrate. Listen to what it says. All right, come on. Boy. There we go. And then her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you gather barley today? And where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." And Ruth told her mother-in-law about the men she had worked with and said, "The name of the man that I worked with today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, who has not forgotten his kindness to the living or the dead." Maybe continued, "This man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers." Ruth the Moabitess said, "He also told me, 'Stay with my young men until they have finished all of my harvest.' So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, 'My daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants, so that nothing will happen to you in another field." And Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvest were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. You see, the reality is that how they celebrate is all in this verse. And you're going, "Oh, what do you mean? What are you talking about? That doesn't look like celebration." Oh, yeah, it is. First off, they're celebrating God's goodness. At the moment, Naomi has no idea who owns the field that produced the bounty of food Ruth has brought home. Even so, what does she say? "May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." She doesn't know who he is. She doesn't know he's a relative. She just knows that he blessed you. And they know that it's God's hand. See what's happening here? Remember what happened last week? Naomi, right? Before all this, what is she saying? "Hey, call me bitterness. Call me Mara. God has dealt bitterly with me. God has abandoned me. God has forgotten me. Oh, may the Lord bless the man who blessed you." Oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. What happened here, Naomi? What do you mean, may the Lord bless the man who noticed you? Now, at that moment, Naomi has no idea who owns the field, but she still wants to bless him. And then Ruth tells her his name. And he says, oh, he's a close relative. He's our family redeemer. Already Grace is starting to turn and heal her hurting heart. How blessed are they who see God's hand in the mundane. You never lack a reason to celebrate God's goodness when your heart is tuned in to see him at work in your life. In one poor home in Bethlehem, there is great rejoicing, but in another home, Boaz sleeps well because God has given him rest. He is more blessed than he knows because Naomi and Ruth have prayed for him. Think about that. I am bad about getting caught up in things, and I'll start feeling sorry for myself. And then I have to stop and think, wait a minute. I know the people in my church are praying for me. I know that my congregation prays for me. And I stop and realize how blessed I am because of what God has given me. I know that God watches over me and cares for me. And I have to stop and say, I'm going to count my blessings. There's an old song, count your blessings, name them one by one. You will be amazed to see what God has done. You know, we need to learn to celebrate God's goodness. Learn to see when God is at work. Because when we stop thinking, oh, this is just a little detail, no, it is God's fingerprints. So they celebrate his goodness, but they also celebrate God's grace. Ruth told her mother-in-law whom she'd worked with and said, the name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. And Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, may the Lord bless him because he's not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead. In other words, he's doing his job as a family redeemer. He doesn't even know he's doing it because the job didn't require that you did it for foreigners. Even though Ruth is a daughter-in-law of Naomi, he doesn't have to provide for, that's the whole thing. The man's a close relative. He's one of our family redeemers. In other words, his job was to take care of Naomi, but he didn't have to do anything for Ruth. And he didn't know about Ruth. He didn't know who Ruth and Naomi were. He kind of knew who Ruth was. He knew that Naomi had returned, but he didn't know their circumstances. They hadn't gone to him and said, hey, can you help us? And none of that. But Ruth just amazingly shows up at his field. Oh, wait a minute. That's not just God. That's not just coincidence. That's God at work. She said, the kindness to the living or the dead. The man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers. The word kindness comes from a Hebrew word used over 200 times in the Old Testament. It's a difficult word to translate because it encompasses love, kindness, loyalty, grace, and mercy. Naomi, who was not so long ago wanted to be called bitter, sees the invisible hand of God at work in leading Ruth to the field of Boaz. Reminds me of that stupid line from the movie Casablanca. Of all the gin joints and all the towns and all the world, she walked into mine. I think Naomi would probably say, of all the fields and all the towns and all the world, Ruth walked into the field of Boaz. That's what I felt like, what it felt like to her. That God arranged all this. Okay? And after all, Naomi has suffered and lost, after all those hard years in Moab, after the long journey back home with Ruth by her side, after leaving full and coming back empty, after all that, she finally realizes the Lord has not forgotten her. The Old Testament law required a close relative to step in and redeem a family member from certain circumstances. Leviticus 25, 25 through 28, if you want to look it up. It allowed the redeemer to buy back a family member sold into slavery or to purchase land sold under hardship. In extreme situations, it allowed the redeemer to avenge the blood of a family member who had been killed. Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10 allowed a man to marry his dead brother's former wife if the brother died childless. In other words, he's married and the woman dies childless. That way the man could raise up a child for his deceased brother and keep the family name alive. Okay? Now, understand something. Naomi did not die childless. Both of her children died early, but she's not childless, so he didn't have to marry Naomi. It wasn't a requirement. He wasn't a brother. He was a family redeemer. So it doesn't mean that he was a brother of Abimelech. He was a close relative. Now, here's the kicker. The law of the kinsman redeemer was never meant to apply to foreigners. It was family law given by God to guide the Jews in time of family crisis. A Jewish man would marry a Jewish woman to help his deceased Jewish brother who was childless. But none of that applied here. Naomi wasn't childless. She had 2 children. Yes, they both grew up. They both did. And Ruth was not Jewish. So she didn't have to, he didn't do anything for her. And it was never meant to apply to a marriage between a Jewish man and a Moabite woman. At this moment in the story, Naomi has no idea how Boaz would respond to the offer to redeem the land and marry Ruth. It was, to say the least, highly irregular, but that's still in the future. All we know at this point is that Ruth happened to meet Boaz, who is the right man in the right place at the right time. Imagine all those coincidences. The morning when Ruth woke up, she had no idea what was about to happen. Oh, but God did. God had it all arranged. God has raised up a redeemer because God did what only God could do, and that's what he did for us. He raised up a redeemer. His name was Jesus Christ. We couldn't save ourselves. We needed a family redeemer. And so Jesus came in and died for us and adopted us into his family. A lot like Boaz did for the Moabite, for Ruth. He didn't have to redeem her, but he did anyway. And you know what? None of that was required. Just like God wasn't required to save us. He died on that cross for us because he wanted to, because he paid the price willingly so that we might be redeemed. Okay? We need to learn to celebrate God's grace. God has done so much for us, but God has raised up a redeemer that did what only God could do. God is the only one who could redeem us. Jesus Christ is the only one who could die on that cross because he's the only one who's sinless. Oh, but God has other plans, and we don't always see them, and we don't always catch the details, but you know what? We need to learn to celebrate God's goodness, and celebrate God's grace, and celebrate God's guidance. Our passage ends with 3 signs of God's guidance. Out of the massive details that happened on that fateful day, we can trace God's fingerprints in the seemingly random events of life. I want you to look at this, okay? Ruth the Moabitess said, he also told me, stay with my young men until they have finished all of my harvest. Now, note that she's called Ruth the Moabitess, but we already know she's from Moabite. So why mention it again? Because we need to remember what foreigners always know. You're not from around here. Not a day passed in the village of Bethlehem without someone remarking on her background. If her dress didn't give her away, then her speech certainly did. Every day she was reminded she wasn't Jewish, which meant she was outside the covenant and therefore a stranger to the grace of God, to the promises of God anyway, as far as the promises to the Jewish nation. She didn't belong. She didn't fit, and it wouldn't be unusual if some folks thought it would be better if she went back to her own people. There's probably people in Bethlehem telling her, go home, you foreigner. We don't want you here. You can call it racism if you like, or give it a fancy name like ethnocentrism, but just say a girl from Moab would never find a home in Bethlehem. That would be true, except for a man named Boaz. He has revealed himself to be a man of character and compassion. Besides that, he's a man of means, and no doubt came from one of the aristocratic families. If Boaz decided to take care of Ruth, no one would dare speak against her. They might gossip behind closed doors. People are people, after all. But no one would bother her while she was under his protection. Ian Campbell points out the same law that forbids her to join the people of God also opened a door of grace for her. The first law said she could not come in. The second law said she could not be kept out because it was provided for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Ruth qualified on all 3 counts. She was a stranger, she was fatherless, and she was a widow. God has always intended to make a way for Moabites to join the people of God. That's the gospel in action even before Christ came. See, God blessed the Israelites not just to bless the Israelites so that they might bless the rest of the world. They missed that somewhere because their status as chosen people, they were chosen to spread the gospel. They were chosen to tell the good news of the God who saved. That's what they were doing. That's what they were designed to do. That's what they were created to do. That's what they were saved to do. Just like us. We were saved so that we might proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. We were saved. Yes, we were saved so that we could go to heaven. We were adopted into the family. Don't doubt that. But part of your salvation means that you are here in order to proclaim the gospel with your life. You know, God always intended to make a way. No one has ever any claim on God's grace. By nature, we are all sinners under God's judgment, and the flaming sword that kept Adam and Eve out of Eden keeps us out too. We have no way back to paradise unless God makes a way. And that's what he did when he sent his son to die for us. He made a way when there was no other way. That's the good news of the gospel of Christ. Number 2, God guided Ruth to a place of protection. So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "My daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants so that nothing may happen to you in another field. In the other field, young men might accost Ruth, seeking to take advantage of her because she was a young widow from another nation. But staying in the field of Boaz, she was protected. And Boaz would be able to keep an eye on her. And not only that, but he provided for her, and he fed for her, and he made sure that she had food to glean." That's what God does. Thus does God plan to protect a young woman while keeping her in the view of one man who would change her life. See, God protects us that way. We don't always see it. We remember the big times. I mean, I can quote to you the big times in my life. But what about yesterday? Did he protect you and you just didn't notice it? I mean, God protected you, kept you safe, allowed you to sleep at night. You slept through the night, right? That was God's protection over you. My pastor, the one that I served with for so long at Del Rio Community Church, worked part-time at Jupiter Christian School. He was on his way to work one morning, and he blew a tire. And lost control and started spinning down the highway, doing 360s. Did not hit one car, and this was in traffic. Missed every car, and came to a stop in front of a telephone pole. A power line, actually, on the side of the road. Now, if you guys know anything about power lines in the United States, you'll know that there's a guy wire that kind of keeps it in place. That there's like 2 of them, one on each side, and it keeps it from moving, right? And these guy wires they form a little triangle between the pole and the back end of the guy wire. Would you like to guess where his car came to stop? Right, in that triangle, facing the telephone pole with the back end of this car facing the guy wire. It looked almost like he put it there on purpose. Let me tell you something. That was God's protection. God provides a place for protection for all of us. We don't owe it to him. He doesn't owe us anything, but he does anyway. He protects you each and every day. You get safely to work. That's God's protection. See, we take things for granted. God provides. And that's what he did for Naomi. He protected her. He put her with Boaz, and Boaz watched over her. Number 3, God guided Ruth to a place of provision. Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal to us, but the barley harvest begins in early April, and the wheat harvest didn't end until the end of June. That means April, May, and June, for 3 solid months, Ruth would be working in the fields along with the other women for at least 7 weeks. Notice that she stayed close to the other women during those long days in the field, and that speaks to her loyalty and to her common sense. It certainly says something about her commitment. She wasn't afraid of hard work. But above all, working the harvest meant she and Naomi would not go hungry. Remember, she brought home enough grain that she carried home the first day 30 to 40 pounds of grain. If she did that every day, they would have enough food to feed them for the year, even if nothing else happened. God has provided a home and food for this young widow from Moab. She is safe and secure in Bethlehem, the house of bread. Here again we see the gospel at work. When Ruth was in the fields of Moab, she reached nothing but sadness and death. She buried her husband in the fields of Moab because the wages of sin is death. But in the fields of Boaz, there's abundant provision. There's enough and more than enough. When Jesus fed the 5,000, after everybody had eaten all they wanted, the disciples collected 12 baskets filled with leftover fish and bread. So it is with our Lord. He provides so much that we can never run out. That means you'll never meet a sinner God can't save. He has grace for the most hopeless among us. Who is the worst sinner on earth? I don't know, although Paul claimed to be. But whoever it is, there's plenty of grace for that man or that woman and plenty left over for everyone else. There is not anyone above God's grace. There is not anyone beyond God's grace. God's grace is available to everyone who accepts it. And if the story ended here, it would be a great story. It would be remarkable. But there's much more to come. Some people think Ruth and Boaz have fallen deeply in love at this point in the story, but we don't know that. And it may be true, but I kind of don't think so. The text doesn't really say that. The emphasis is not on their inner emotional state. Boaz had noticed Ruth and knew all about her noble character. It emphasizes her character, not her beauty. And Ruth had experienced undeserved kindness from Boaz. That's all we know. But see, the real hero of the story here isn't Boaz. It isn't Ruth. It isn't Naomi. It's the Lord. Because the Lord was working behind the scenes to bring it all to pass. He orchestrated every single detail, including the famine that caused Naomi and Elimelech and their two sons to go to Moab in the first place. He arranged for Ruth to happen upon the field of Boaz. He caused Boaz to look upon her with compassion. He ensured she had plenty of grain to share with Naomi. If we step back even further, we can see that he arranged for Boaz to be a relative of Elimelech and thus qualified to redeem the land for Naomi. And here's the final fact to consider. In the book of Ruth, we hear that everyone except the main character, Naomi speaks, Ruth speaks, and Boaz speaks, but God never utters a word. Yet he is the prime mover behind the scenes. Every detail points to the sovereign Lord of the universe. He leaves his fingerprints hiding in plain sight. The writer wants to see God at work in the ordinary details of life. Blessed are they who see the Lord everywhere. If God is with us, then we are never alone, and we will never truly be on our own. When God is involved, there are no ordinary days because every day matters to him. That means you've never had an ordinary day, and you never will. Alva J. McLean put it this way: from the fall of a raindrop to the fall of an empire, it is all under the providential control of God. Sometimes I think we need to be reminded that God is to be seen, not just in the big events. Oh, it's easy to spot them, when he protected me during the coma and all the other things that happened. It's really easy to see him in the big events. But sometimes we miss those tiny details when it's God's fingerprints working it out. I remember one day I came home and I was in a really foul mood. I was so grouchy, and it had been a bad week, and things were just going hard, and I was frustrated with endless meetings and long phone calls and unplanned interruptions, and I spent the week dealing with contrary students. So I got on the phone and talked to my prayer partner, Harvey, and I was complaining to him. And he listened sympathetically, and then he said he was sorry that I had a bad day. It really didn't seem that he felt he didn't grasp the roots of my frustration, so I started to complain all over again. And when he decided he'd heard enough, he said, "Michael, you need to grow up." I didn't like that. For one thing, I didn't want to grow up. I wanted to complain. Don't you ever believe what you preach? Harvey's a pastor, too. Oh, boy, that hit below the belt. Throwing my sermons back at me? But he was right. Stop complaining, open your eyes, and see how God has been good to you. And then he said, play the God-siding game. And I told him I didn't want to play that game. I wanted to complain. I wanted to grumble, but I ended up agreeing to play the game. It's real simple. Stop, look around, and see where you can find God's fingerprints in your life. And when you do it long enough, you'll start to see him in the very small things, everything he does for you each and every day. A phone call when you're down, my prayer partner, Harvey. The sun peeking through the clouds, a kind email, a friend who dropped by, a note from one of your friends or your family or one of your children with good news, a hymn that brings you joy, a song on the radio when you hear, we're listening to K-Love or Way FM and listening to a Christian song and it comes on the radio and it just encourages you and builds you up. When you start paying attention, you'll see God everywhere. Sometimes it's just a small little thing God would do, but sometimes that caused me to say, That was the Lord. But my experience is not unusual. If you keep your eyes open, soon you'll see God everywhere. Often we focus on the spectacular answers to prayer. God save my mom, keep her from dying, and she heals and she gets better. That's not always where you're going to see God. Look for God's fingerprints in the small things and listen for the whisper of his voice. I found myself praying, open my eyes and my heart that I might see you everywhere. And you know what? It enabled me to see God at work in places where I never thought I'd see him before. It's a great advance spiritually to see God at work all the time in every situation, no matter whether you're happy or sad. If we live long enough, we will see it all. We will be betrayed, and we will betray. We will laugh, and we will cry, and we will sing for joy, and we will weep with bitter tears. Friends will amaze us, and they will frustrate us. We will win great victories and suffer humiliating defeats. God has ordained that our journey through life is not a straight line. If you try to graft your own life, your line will end up going in all directions. It will be 2 steps forward and 3 steps back and 4 steps down and 2 steps to the side, 6 up, 7 back, and sometimes life will seem to take you in circles. We can't escape the changing nature of life, but we can change how we look at it. Surely it's a major point in Ruth's story, as she starts to see God's fingerprints. I mean, not all days are alike. If someone had told Ruth early in the morning that what was about to happen, she would not have believed it. She got up and went to the field hoping to gather barley to help. She just happened to end up on Boaz's field. She didn't know what God was doing, but God did, and he used her obedience to open a new chapter in her life, and he will do the same for you and me. See, guys, God is at work. We just don't always see it. Because God is good, he cares for us. Because God is gracious, he gives us what we don't deserve. Because God is our guide, he leads us even when we don't realize it. The passage began with Ruth bringing home the grain Boaz gave her. If you had asked, does God care for you, she would have looked at you and was staggering under the heavy load. What do you think? And look at all this grain. In every detail of this story, God is at work. He caused Ruth to happen upon the field of Boaz. He stirred up Boaz to notice Ruth and then to shower her with kindness. He saw Naomi's misery and turned it to joy. That's God. That's what he does. That's how he works. No wonder those 2 widows celebrated. They had seen the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. The story is far from over, but as the sun goes down over the day of days, 2 widows in Bethlehem are celebrating God's goodness to them, celebrating God's grace to them, and celebrating God's guidance to them. Jarvis James says, if you have a pulse, you ought to have a praise. He's right. Are you breathing? Then let everything that has breath praise the Lord. Is your heart beating? Then let it beat and praise the Lord who has not forgotten you. Someone reading this story is struggling because you feel God has forgotten you. Perhaps you feel bitter because others have mistreated you. Maybe your sin has put you in a very bad place. If so, remember this. God has not stopped showing kindness to you. He wants your heart, and he will do whatever it takes to draw you to him. He calls you by his grace, and he whispers through your pain, my child, I have not forgotten you. How will you respond? What will you say to the Lord's invitation? He's knocking at the door of your heart. Lay aside your doubt and be done with your fears. Go to the door, open it, and say, Lord Jesus, you are welcome to come in. Come to Jesus, my friend. If you already know him, don't delay. Don't say, oh, I'd rather be miserable. Why walk in darkness when you can come to Christ and walk in the light? He saw Naomi's misery, and he turned it into joy, just like he does us. He says, my brothers and sisters, my children, God has redeemed us. He's adopted us in his family. You're the children of God. We are followers of the way, but we are adopted children of God. And he loves us. And he made a way for us when there was no other way. And he does it each and every single day. Maybe you already know him. Maybe you already have that relationship. Stop and see his fingerprints. Don't walk around and say, well, God, what have you done for me lately? God has done for you more than you'll ever repay, and he does so every single day. I still remember, and this one's This is back when I first started, when I was first in the ministry. I was working, I was getting ready to go to seminary, and I was working at Publix grocery store. And I was struggling financially. Publix is not the greatest paying place. Publix had this thing called a quarterly bonus that you got when the store did well. And I had no idea when it was coming. But I knew I had bills to pay, and I didn't have enough in the paycheck to pay those bills. So I began to pray to God, please, I need your hand. I need your provision. Help me pay this bill. And that day, I got to work, and I got my bonus check. It just happened that it was just enough. Actually, it was a little bit more than what I needed to pay that bill. Now, I didn't stay at Publix long. I ended up working there until I went to school in August, and I left for Texas. But I'll tell you right now, I've always remembered that small kindness. The bill wasn't big, but it was enough in the bonus check to pay that bill, which is my car insurance, which nowadays that'd be a small amount, $185 every 6 months. I wish my car insurance was that small. But God provided. God does that each and every day. Sometimes we notice, most of the time we don't. Just like he did with Ruth, just like we did with Naomi. God's hand is at work. So don't say, oh, I'd rather be miserable. I don't see how God helps me. I'm always sick. I'm always miserable. The doctors don't know what's wrong with me. You know what? God's hand's at work, and he works out all the details. It's time to stop complaining and start praising, because God is at work. This story in Bethlehem is far from over. If you stay tuned, Naomi's about to come up with a shocking plan to get Grace, Naomi, and Ruth together, and you won't believe what happens in chapter 3. But I will tell you this. It was all God's plan. Naomi didn't do any of this. Just like he does for us, God has it all worked out. There's nothing beyond his help. There's nothing beyond his hope. There's nothing beyond his love. Let's close in prayer. Father, help us to see your fingerprints.